Okay, here we go. Starting chapter 7. Chapter 7 says it's on activity-based costing. Activity-based costing, a tool and an aid in decision-making. Once again, I try and sell you on this. There's some really good concepts in this. I don't care if you're an accounting major, business major. I don't care if you're anything even related. The simple premise of this chapter is, can we take money and somehow, in a way, allocate it fairly to people? At this college, do you think that, again, they've taken all the costs of this college and have they allocated them to you in a fair manner? I assure you they haven't. I assure you that this college is not using activity-based costing at all. Colleges do not use, again, that model. I won't get into why, but again, colleges compete on a very different basis. When you go and buy a car, you try and you can compare two automobiles in a very objective way. But when you go to a college is a very subjective decision. And so again, colleges don't usually use activity-based costing to try and cost students and apply the bill to them. It's not about fairness as much as it is about, here's the cost, we're going to just make everybody pay the same, and then they give you a little bit of scholarship. But in this chapter, again, that's not the way that Ford and General Motors and Caterpillar and Toyota and Honda, they don't do it that way. They will use activity-based costing. And it's simply a method that says, let's go back and try and allocate money in a fair way that really is representative of how the money is consumed. I am holding a piece of paper. This is my lecture notes from Chapter 7. I don't know how close I'd have to get. But again, this is the Chapter 7 outline. It's very good. I just did this last semester. It's brand new. But again, the premise here is it tells you all about activity-based costing, all the details. I'm going to stay at a higher level in class. But let me just try and remind you where we're going to begin at. What we're going to begin is that you remember from earlier chapters, I think in Chapter 2 and in Chapter 4, we learned that we have what's called product costing, and that's Chapter 2 and 4, we have direct materials, direct labor, and we have overhead, and those go into a product. And then we have these other costs, we call them period costs. And the period costs are selling costs, do you remember? Administrative costs, and they do not go into a product. Again, period costs are kept separate. They're not put in the cost of a desk or a chair. The selling costs, again, they go on an income statement, but they're not allowed to be part of the product. All these rules you learned are simply not applicable to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 says we'll do whatever we want, because Chapter 7 is based on decision making. And it doesn't, again, these numbers, what you learned before was what's commonly used in our society and mandated by the Financial Accounting Standards Board. The Financial Accounting Standard Board says you must put these three in to a product cost. But in Chapter 7, many companies have said, well, we'll just use our own system that we'll never publish, and we'll use it to do decision making, and they usually call it an activity-based costing system. Anyway, there are no rules, but in general, here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be focusing on all these costs, and we're going to be focusing on how can we allocate them to a product, to a service, or a customer in a fair way. I will tell you that if we do go into a manufacturer, that what we'll find is most manufacturers will still do it exactly how we've described. What I mean is even if they use activity-based costing, they'll still put materials, labor, and overhead in the product. But this is the one that they'll use A, B, C on, activity-based costing. Because do you remember, it was so inaccurate? We know how much direct material goes in a desk or a chair. We know how much direct labor goes in a desk or a chair. But overhead, we don't know how much, light, utilities, that's the hard one. So when we look at activity-based costing, the premise is simply take this overhead. Do you remember all the things that were in here? Lights, electricity, janitor's salary, property taxes, depreciation on the building. There's so many things that's what we're going to start with. Is we're going to say, well, could we at least use activity-based costing and come up with a fair way to take this overhead and allocate it? And the premise is we're going to do it. We're going to take money, like we might take again the electricity, and divide it by a base. And we're going to see if by doing this we can get a fair price per something. If it was electricity, it might be per square foot. It might be per machine hour. It might even be, I don't know, it could be per part, whatever you're making. But let me again go and show you something that's real life. Let me jump all the way to the heart of not process costing, but activity-based costing, and show you some real. When I was out in practice, these are real activity-based costing examples. All right. Make this a little bigger if I can. I think that's big enough for you to see at home. Oops. Let's make it one bigger. See if I can fit it in there. This is a real example of when I worked for a manufacturer. The manufacturer was, again, not working on materials. They were not working on labor. They wanted to figure out how can we cost our products in a fair way, but let's look at one little slice of overhead. They wanted to look at material handling. Can you see that out in a plant? Can you see the fork trucks? Can you see the conveyor belts? Can you see the robots picking things up, machines boxing things? Again, that's material handling. How can we fairly price out each thing we make for the cost of material handling? Again, we've got big storage areas. We've got automatic storage and retrieval machinery and equipment that goes out and gets things, brings them back, moves the material. We've got material that moves into the plant. Then it's, we've got big gantry cranes that come overhead and drop material. We've again got these fork trucks, lift trucks, all kinds of equipment to move things. And we're saying, how do you take all that and get it on the price of a gear, or get it on the price of a clutch lever? Or a gear shifter, a clutch lever on the floor. How do you do that? Well, they said, let's just take this one item, and first of all, let's get all these costs together. So they went out and said, what's all the money? And let's put it in a numerator. And again, you can see, they went out and said, what's a fork truck, what's a forklift? A fork truck depreciation. And that's money. Let's go get the propane gas that it takes to run those fork trucks. Let's get the men and women who do the maintenance on fixing those. Put that in the numerator. The labor and the parts that go into maintenance, all that. Let's get depreciation on robots. That's money. Depreciation on conveyor belts. That's money. Wages for people that work in material handling. Again, there's going to be a lot of those people. There's going to be, actually, I don't even have it. There's going to be computers. Again, they're going to use computers to, again, track the materials. They're probably going to use barcode scanners. There's again, let me see, I said forklift depreciation, fork truck, that's the same thing. And then they're going to have ASRSs, automatic storage and retrieval systems. Those again are robots that go back and get material and bring it out. There's going to be gantry cranes. I think that's what they call them. Big cranes that go overhead and carry heavy steel and heavy subassemblies. All this is just money. And they said, what are we going to divide by? Again, and the issue for activity-based costing is what's fair. And what's usually fair in the denominator. It's super crucial to pick the denominator. Activity-based costing says take the costs in the numerator and get an activity-based costing, get an activity in the denominator that again does reflect the usage of these costs. What makes these costs go up? What makes these costs go down? That's what we want in the denominator to correctly reflect, again, the usage of these resources. In this case, this company, and I didn't do it, somebody that was far brighter than me and came before me many years, said, I'll tell you what we're going to use. And they looked at it and they said, How about what drives all those costs is the number of moves. In other words, can you see it? Every time you move a part, every time you move a material, it does what? If you move anything in the plant, it takes more fork trucks, it takes more propane gas, it causes more wear and maintenance, more depreciation on road. Moving things is what causes this. So they said, let's divide by the number of moves. Well, in a real plant environment, you have to really decide, what's a move? So they sat down, again, if this is the criteria you're going to use, or this is the measurement criteria, you got to come up with, what is a move? They decided any movement between workstations, machines, is a move. And when you bring material into the plant, that's a move. When you take it out to the shipping docks, that's a move. And again, you might say, well, all right, now that they know what a move is, how do they count them? Well, our plant had something called a production routing. On the production routing, everywhere the piece part went, everywhere a part went was on the production routing. Somebody in scheduling would make that. I don't know if you're familiar, but the scheduling department would make a production routing of where it would go. It would show you every machine. So if there were 8 machines, that would be 8 moves. 8 moves, and then not just 8, but 10. 8 moves in the plant, but 1 to bring it into the plant, the material into the plant, that's 9. And when you ship it out of the plant or ship it to an area to be subassembled, that was 10. So if you said we're going to divide by 10, but to get the number of moves, they actually then took the number of moves times all the parts they're going to make in a year. So if they said we're going to make 10,000 of that part that takes 10 moves, well, 10,000 times 10 is 100,000 we're going to put in there. The denominator became the number of moves for every part that we make in the plant for a year. These were all the annual cost divided by all the annual moves, and it came out to be pennies per move. But then, when you went to cost any part in the plant, you would just get the production routing, and on the production routing, you'd count the number of moves, and you could get this rate, and then you could say, this is the exact amount, this many moves on this part times this rate will cost out the exact amount that part takes for moves. Can you see the beauty in it? And that now you have something that's actually going to reflect that one part that moves a lot is going to cost much more than a part that doesn't move at all. If you really go back and look at it, the old way we did it, do you remember where we just take all the overhead and divide by one base? Well, it never did that. Whatever the base was, hours or machine hours, had nothing to do with moves. But this does. This takes this money out of overhead. So let's move it into its own pool. Let's divide by an activity base that's fair and will cost every part in a fair, objective way that reflects more or less of something. That's why they call it activity. The activity goes to the denominator. Based costing, the costs go in the numerator. And it's based, again, on the activity and getting a rate. Let me show you another one. Activity-based costing to give you an idea. Here's another real example. This one. Let me erase that a little bit. I'm going to touch my camera just a second. That sounds odd, doesn't it? I'm going to touch my camera. I just want to see, I'm getting some kind of, it's shutting off automatically and I don't want it to, and I'm wondering if it's just because it shuts off automatically if you don't touch it. All right, here's another one that I really came across over the years in manufacturing, quality costs. Okay, I want you to think about quality. This is a very expensive area in most companies. I mean, you don't just have a guy that stands there, oh, it looks good to me. Most of the time nowadays, if you're making something, you have to have criteria. You have to have very expensive devices and fixtures to measure quality, to measure something dimensionally. You have to have a fixture to put it in. You have to have a digital readout. You have to keep the room a constant temperature, because many times if the room's not a constant temperature, things will expand or contract. Sometimes if you want to look at the metallurgical characteristics, you have to cut it in half and then look at it with a microscope. And the microscopes are really expensive. They're not cheap microscopes. So you're talking about extremely expensive tooling just to go and look at how something if something's in good quality. Think about even a spring. If you make a spring, you have to have a device that measures, again, the amount of compression the spring takes. And again, the amount of pounds it takes before it will compress. And it has to be perfect. If it isn't perfect, it won't work right, whatever its application is. Well, anyway, the quality costs, there's wages for these engineers, these men and women, and they're expensive. They usually they usually don't have PhDs, but they usually have advanced degrees. And they're usually engineers, and engineers are expensive. Depreciation on the measurement tools. Those tools are super expensive. The cost of training the people. Well, they might have went to a very prestigious college, but they still need to be trained in your equipment and your methodologies. The cost of ruining materials. Guess what? Most of the time, when they test things for quality, many times they'll ruin it. They'll ruin it through either, many times it's used, but sometimes they'll even cut it in half, or they'll destroy it just to see how much abuse it will take. The computers, they use very sophisticated computers, they use a lot of electricity. All this is money. All of it, this is just all money. And that's the money in the numerator. What do you think they used? They said, well, what drives all these costs? Well, the number of quality inspections, they said. Let's take all the costs for a year and divide by all the number of quality inspections for a year, and we'll get a rate per inspection. Let's just say the rate comes out to be I don't know why, but my camera went off there again. It seems like it's limited to a 5-minute. I have some kind of limit on how big of a tape I can make or a video. Anyway, look at this, occupancy. Look how expensive it is for you to sit in this room. Heat costs they call it occupancy. For you to sit in a room is occupied. Lighting it, water in the bathrooms, depreciation on this building, janitorial wages. I guarantee you, janitors always work. Maintenance people. There's always people fixing all this stuff in this building. Painting it, repairs. These are huge costs, once again. Big costs. What do we divide by? Well, almost everybody agrees divide by square feet. Divide by square feet, and you'll get the rate per square foot. Let's again say that it costs $1,000. Let's say it costs $1,000, probably more than that. Let's say it costs $10,000 per square foot. You take all this and you divide by the square foot of your factory or whatever it is, even if this college is 10,000. This is a weird one, and I just want to show it to you. Do you remember in the previous two how easy it was to say you take a part, you charge it for its moves? In the previous one, you take a part and you charge it for the number of inspections, quality inspections. But how do you take a part and charge it for square footage? A part or a chair or a desk or an automobile, it doesn't use square feet. It doesn't use square feet. So let me just verbally say what the company that I thought was the best that ever handled this was Caterpillar. They said, all right, let's take the $10,000. We can't really charge a, I just got a text. Okay. I'm going to turn this off. You can't really go back and charge $10,000 to any part. So Caterpillar said, well, what do we know now that it costs $10,000 for a square foot? Here's what they did. They said, if you're a man or a woman or even a machine, and you work in let's say you work in a 10 by 10 square footage area. If it's 10 by 10, we're going to take 10 by 10, which is 100 square feet, and we're going to allocate, again, 100 square feet times $10,000. That's going to be, I believe, $1 million, isn't it? We have to, let me see, 10,000, 100 square feet. That will be, that's $1 million. We're going to add $1 million to your work area. And every time you work on a part, every hour that goes by, we're going to charge that $1 million by the hour to the part. So if you actually, by the way, let's say a man or a woman works 2,000 hours in a year, which is what they work, 2,000 hours a year into $1 million, that's going to be, I think, about $50 an hour. I don't know what that is. Let me see, let's knock off, that should be 3 out of 3, 2 into that is, yeah, that's going to be $500, yeah, I think so. $500. Now, I know I'm tossing these numbers out, but I'm getting you to see that now we're going to have to charge a much higher price to capture occupancy. And that's what they did. Every man that occupied a space, or woman, Or if it was a machine, we'd say take that occupancy cost, divide it by the hours that you can use in a year, and charge any part that runs through that area, by the hour. So you can see again that companies do try and charge for occupancy. It's one of the harder ones. And by the way, did you see that we have to do a double allocation on that? The first allocation just gets a rate. The second allocation allocates to a different area, and then the third allocation is where we actually put it on a part. If you don't see that entirely, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to test you to that level, but I just love this one just because, again, it's such a hardship. All companies deal with the problem of how do you charge for occupancy. Anyway, that's activity-based costing. And I want to do the first problem, and I think I have it with me. I hope I do. I thought I did, but probably. The first problem, your author's just trying to get you to think. And this is the first problem. Your author, let's just pretend in this first problem, it's exercise 7.1. And in exercise 7.1, your author just says, I want you to think about how costs occur. And let's pretend I'm adding this. Let's say we make chairs. And your author begins the chapter by describing costs and how they're triggered. Hang on here, yeah, got it. Your author says some costs. Now remember, your author's getting into the issue of, he's trying to get you as a student to understand what triggers, the bases. I want you to think about what causes a cost. Most students can say, I can group costs that are similar together. I can get a numerator. But the denominator is a little bit harder. So it says, some costs are triggered. Triggered means they are incremented, they are incurred. Like if you drive a mile. If you drive a mile in your car, you consume gas. That's what we call a unit cost. A unit activity cost. In other words, every time 1 mile, every time you have a unit of a mile, it triggers the cost of gasoline. But batch, if you drive 3,000 miles, then guess what? You got to change your oil. That's a batch cost. Some costs are triggered every time you drive a mile. Some costs are triggered when you drive a batch of miles. How about another one? New tires for a car. If you drive 40,000 miles, a batch, you'll have to do what? Buy new tires. How about product? Some costs are not triggered by a unit or batch, but by a product. If I could go along with my car, how about, again, in this case, if you are somebody who has, you have pickup trucks, cars, sport utilities, you have different vehicles. There are cars, again, every time you add a new product, like if you had sport utilities, if you had pickup trucks, there's certain costs. You're going to have more mechanics, advertising for those unique products. Customer costs, those are what they say. A certain customer calls up and says, I want certain unique attributes for my order. Those are triggered by the customer. You see, again, sometimes a customer can trigger a cost. Let's say a customer wants something unique. They want a truck, but they want a special truck for farming. And they want some solutions equipment that sprays solutions. Well, that clearly is going to be driven by that unique customer. A customer cost. By the way, you might even have, from a company standpoint, you might advertise for certain customers. Let's again say you advertise to farmers for, again, solution trucks. That's a certain type of customer. You might advertise to, let's say, females for, again, certain types of sport utilities that you know females like. Anyway, that's advertising that goes unique to a customer. Then your author says there's some costs that cannot be triggered. They're organization sustaining. I don't know that I completely agree with your author on this, but this is really one where he says you can't allocate it. Anyway, he wants us to take these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and he wants us to try and say, when would these costs be triggered? Would these costs be caused or triggered? Again, would they be caused every time you build a chair? every time you build a batch of chairs, every time you build a new, like a table, you introduce a new table. Or when you get a new customer, again, McDonald's wants to buy a bunch of your chairs. Or if you don't think you can organize, or if you don't think you can allocate it, you throw it into organization sustain and say, we're not going to allocate that. We're not going to use ABC costing. We're just going to put it in a pile aside and not allocate that cost. I worked for companies that hardly ever did that. They found a way to allocate all their costs. I think that's the appropriate way to do it. You try and be clever enough that you come up with a fair way to allocate the money. Anyway, let's do these. This one says, now all of these are money. You're spending money. And the author is asking, are these triggered by a unit, batch, or product? Now these are money. I want you know, the money we spend to receive materials. I mean, that's trucking costs to get those in there. Managing parts inventories, those are people. And computers. Do rough milling work, that's machining. That's going to cost money for the machine, the electricity. All these are costs. Interview and process new employees. You're going to have people in human relations that does that. Design new products. You're going to have engineers that do that. All these are costs, and he's saying what triggers them. The truth is, every one of these is completely debatable. These are all so debatable. None of the answers that I'm going to give you in a minute are right. We are generalizing. In real life, you have to really look at these and decide what's right. And I'll try and address that, but I'm saying we're generalizing. In general, let's again go back to our original premise. We are making chairs. You with me? Chairs, let's put it back on the chair. I don't know. This is a weird looking chair. I'm having issues with my chair. How about this? Chair looks like this, got some legs on it, and there's the back. Okay, that looks more like a pinball machine. Okay, we're making pinball machines, because that looks like a pinball machine. Anyway, but you can sit on a pinball machine. Anyway, you receive raw materials from suppliers, and it's asked on us, the author's asked us, what triggers this? The answers he wants is unit, batch, product, customer, organization, sustaining. Remember, this one's really saying you can allocate it. All right, in this case, if you receive raw materials from suppliers, does that, do you get raw materials? Do you truck things in every time you make a chair? No, you don't. Do you get raw materials and truckloads of materials every time you make a batch of chairs? Yes. This one's supposed to be batch. Now, if you said to me, no, Chuck, I don't agree with you. I think if you were making a big ship, what if you were making giant ships? Every time you made one ship, you'd have to receive raw materials. You're absolutely right. In its unit. Do you see my point? None of the answers we're doing are right. They're only right relative to the company you're working in. They're debatable. I'm generalizing that in most companies, you don't get raw materials every time you make a chair. But again, it depends. If you were making giant skyscraper buildings, well, you'd absolutely get it every unit. When you make a skyscraper, you go get a bunch of raw materials. Now, it could be that in some companies, they don't get it by batch. That they don't do anything until the customer orders. So it could be that, again, you receive raw materials when you get a customer order. So these are all, again, generalizations. But in general, we'll go with the author's answers. This complies and parallels what I've learned. Usually you order raw materials in batches to make batches. How about managing parts inventories? That's, again, assigning part numbers, going out and getting parts, knowing how many parts to order. This again takes space, it takes men, women, and computers. It's money. Well, again, do we do that? Do we have those costs incurred every time we make a unit? I would actually say yes, we do. Do we have to manage parts inventory every time we make a batch? Yeah, we got to move parts around. Yes. Do we have parts works on parts when we, start a new product? Let's say we start again making not a chair but a table. Yes. How about when a customer orders some goods or we get a new customer? We go out and try and get a new customer. Yes, the answer is yes to all of them. Well, which one do you think is the most common? Well, usually, again, all of these are yes, but you'll spend the most money managing your parts inventories when you introduce a new product. In other words, every time you make a unit, every time you make a batch, every time you get a customer, but when do you really go out and do a lot of managing of your parts inventory? When you introduce a new product. So this one is product. Do rough milling work. Milling is where you slice off shavings. In this case, mill and it's kind of like a lathe, only the cutting piece turns instead of the cutting piece turns when you mill. Anyway, I know you don't care about that, so we'll go on. Anyway, the rough milling work on products. Now think about this. Milling means we're shaving some of the wood off. We're shaving. Do you think we do that when we mill the wood? Do we do it every time we make a chair? We really do. Every time we make a chair, we shave some of the wood off because that's kind of shaping the chair leg. Do we do it when we make a batch? Well, we do it to every unit. The units are in a batch, so if you said, yeah, you do it every batch, but this has occurred at the unit level. It really is. So again, this is going to be every unit. You see, the author is just trying to get you to think, and so am I. What triggers a cost in general? This is not, again, absolute. These are all debatable. But in general, if you mill a table or a chair leg, you're going to do it to every leg, every unit. When you manage parts inventories, every one of them, but the biggest management you do is when you introduce a new product. Receive raw materials from suppliers, you usually do that in a batch. How about this? When you design new products, do you design a new product every time you make a chair? No. Do you design a new product when you make a batch? No. Do you do it when you introduce a new product? Yes. So this is again driven by product cost. This is what we call designing a new chair. See it? How about this? Interview and process new employees in the personnel department. Do you interview? Now remember, we have people down there in human relations. They're interviewing, they're hiring new people, filling out forms, standing in line, wasting time. Anyway, when you incur this money, do you do it every time you make a chair? No. Well, you really could say you do. Do you do it every time you make a batch of chairs? Well, you probably do. Do you do it every time you introduce a new product? Yes, you probably, when you introduce a new product, you are going to interview people. How about when you go out and let's say you get a new customer? This is going to be McDonald's, and they're going to buy all your chairs and tables for their restaurants. Well, again, I think you could say, you know what, Chuck, it seems to me that no matter what you're doing, no matter if you're introducing, if you've got new customers, new products, if you're making batches of chairs or units, you're doing this. So your author contends there isn't really any one of these that generates this lot. He wants to use organization sustaining. All right. Okay, it went off. I still haven't figured out why. I'm trying to figure that out tonight. Maybe I can prevent it and get longer, bigger files. Anyway, I don't agree with this, and that's why your author does say it's debatable. I really do think that when you interview, this is organization sustaining, but I do think if you really wanted to pick, when you introduce a new product, there's a good chance, or if you get a new customer, you're going to do what? Do a very large amount of interviewing and hiring new employees. But let's say you're a company like Caterpillar, General Motors. Again, they really, when they revise their products, and they don't really get that many new customers. They actually are losing customers. Do you see that again for General Motors or for somebody like Ford, that they probably, and even Illinois Wesleyan University, they interview and process new employees all the time. It goes on every year. So he makes a point, you really can't identify with any one of these triggers. It's just going to be organization sustaining. It goes on all year. I would make the point that in some companies this would not be true. This would be done very heavily when you obtain a new customer, a new product. But I do agree to some extent it happens, constantly. When you perform, let's do this one, use the general factory building. Your author says, do you use the general factory building when you make one chair? Yes. When you make a batch of chairs? Yes. When you introduce a new product? Yes. When you obtain new customers? Yes. You use the general maintenance building. So he says, don't even try and do that. Just put it in organization sustaining. Do I agree with that? No, I don't. Again, I think this is debatable. Your author says organization sustaining. Do you remember what I said? At the companies I worked with, we allocated it all the way back to unit level and said that, again, we're going to allocate that to units. Do I think your author's wrong? No, I don't know if I think your author's wrong. I wouldn't say it that way. I'd say I think your author is right, but I think this is a case where there's two rights. One company, Caterpillar, decided, all right, you can call that organization sustaining, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take that and I'm going to try and allocate it to everything I make, and I'm going to get it all the way back to the unit level. Remember they did it? They did it by square footage. I showed you that about 10 minutes ago. But anyway, some of these, but again, by the way, on the test, if I put these on the test, I will parallel these answers. You with me? I never deviate from the textbook. Even though I don't believe some of these answers, I'll go along with these answers because they're in your textbook. But yes, I would say using the general factory building is not organization sustaining. I would say you do allocate it. You can allocate it all the way back to the unit if you're clever. But your author says don't even try. Just take that stuff and put it in organization sustaining. Don't allocate it. How about issue purchase orders for a job? How often do you issue a purchase order? Do you issue a purchase order for materials? For materials, if you're making chairs every time you make a new unit? No. Usually you do it what? When you make a batch. Okay, so that's batch 2. Now, once again, I'll tell you, this may not be true at all if you're working in a company that, let's again say you make something like, again, an ocean liner. They might issue a purchase order not for a batch, but just for one unit. They're going to have to do all kinds of POs for just one unit. I guess if it's an ocean liner, I don't know. That one gets hard. But again, this is a generalization to companies like Ford, General Motors, Toyota, Honda. Perform periodic preventative maintenance. Do you think they go out and work on the machines and fix up the machines every time they make a chair? They don't. Do they do it every time they make a batch of chairs? They might. They really might. Do they do it when they introduce a new product? Well, they could. Again, if they introduce a new product, that doesn't seem that likely. When they obtain a new type of customer, do they go out and do periodic maintenance? I don't think there's much relationship here. I would say that the best answer is probably many companies do periodic maintenance between batches. So it may be batch. Your author doesn't think that, though. Your author says it's periodic. It's done during the year. And it has nothing to do, he puts that word in there specifically. And by the way, he's right on this, at least in one way. On the companies that I worked for, usually about once a quarter or or semi-annually, they would go out and do huge amounts of preventative maintenance, and it had nothing to do with making one chair or making a batch of chairs. They just did it. And it had no relation to the products or the customers. So again, I think that he's very just in saying this is organization sustaining. Now, what if you worked in a company that every time they make a batch, let's say they make a batch of chairs, and now they're going to make a batch of tables. And in between batches, they clean those machines, lubricate those machines, refill them with coolant, put new tooling in them, then it really wouldn't be. That would not be the answer. It would be if they said perform maintenance on general use equipment, it might be per batch. That would be very logical. Probably it'd never be per unit, probably never be per product. I doubt it would be for customer. That would be your most likely. But your author puts a word in there that he justifies that, periodic. And because he says it's periodic, he says it's not based on, batches. We just do it once a year or quarterly. Anyway, that's exercise 7.1. I'm going to stop here today, and in the next video, we're going to work exercise 7.2 and 7.3, and we might get a little bit further than that. But anyway, also, I'm going to give you a quiz. I'm either going to give you a quiz on Moodle, or I'm going to give you a quiz. Yeah, I'm going to give you a quiz somehow through Moodle. So keep your eye open on your, your email accounts. And by the way, anytime you want during the class, just email me if you have a question. I think I'm going to use email at first, and then if some of you have complex questions, maybe I'll move over to Skype and start Skyping with you, or maybe I'll use one of the Google applications to chat with you. But I'll see how many questions you have and how complex they are. And by the way, I will post everything for Chapter 7. I know I haven't posted the lecture notes yet, and I will. And I'll post the study quiz, and I'll post the outline. I'll do that tonight. But that should be previous to when you watch this. So it should be, by the time you watch this, all that should be there. Okay, I'll shut down now. I hope you're having a good break.